Hello and welcome back to another World of Warcraft lore video. This time we are going to be talking about Fandral Staghelm. This guy's a character with a long and varied history that shifts between good and evil, and while he has had involvement in a lot of key events, I think a lot of the backstory and the filler in between those events hasn't really been filled out too well by Blizzard. But anyway, let's start from the very start, I guess. And yeah, he does go back to the days of the War of the Ancients, but we really just don't know much about what he did in the conflict. He is quite militaristic, and his later involvement in the War of the Shifting Sands does suggest that he was a strong military leader, so we can assume that he was involved with the War of the Ancients in some sort of military capacity. After the war is over, and the post-Sundering Night Elf Society was established, he was then in a constant power struggle with Tyrande. Essentially, he had a very different outlook for things. He wanted a more militaristic and regimented society, whereas she was far more okay with a bit more peace and freedom, that kind of thing. After the War of the Ancients, Malfurion ended up spending quite a lot of time inside the Emerald Dream. This essentially took him out of the picture, and it meant that he just wasn't competition for Fandral. Now, just before Malfurion and the other druids entered their slumber, the Cenarian Circle was formed. This is just the central organisation for druids, and Fandral was present at the founding, as we know from one of the comics, so I suppose that we can assume that he took up druidism, but since he was kind of alive and kicking for a lot of those 9,000 years in between the War of the Ancients and the War of the Shifting Sands, well, he was going about the place, so chances are he didn't enter the same slumber as many of the other elder druids. At some point after the war, he ended up marrying, and he had a son called Valstan. His wife did unfortunately die during childbirth, which meant that Valstan and his wife Liara were essentially the only family that Fandral had. Now, not a great deal happened for quite a long time. In fact, until 9,000 years later, during the War of the Shifting Sands. Underneath the sands of Silithus, Cthulhu and the Kiraj had spent millennia rebuilding and growing in power. This was, of course, after Cthulhu's defeat by the Titans. Eventually, they were actually powerful enough to threaten the Night Elves, and while there were other races on Kalimdor, the Night Elves were the dominant one at the time, so it really just fell to them to defend. Also, Silithus was very close to some of their western settlements, and places like, say, Feralis that have Feathermoon Isle. Fandral was a experienced and very well-regarded general, so the leadership of the Night Elf armies fell to him. Through solid leadership and some very creative tactics, he managed to defeat the Kiraj in a number of key engagements. On the whole, the war was going quite well for the Night Elves. Things really, because of that, weren't going too well for the Kiraj, and this led to them naming Fandral the Hand of the Earth, probably in reference to how he basically swept their troops away with his excellent strategy. General Rajax was convinced that they could still win the war, though, basically just by throwing more and more troops at the problem until the Night Elves would eventually just lose in a war of attrition. However, the Twin Emperors overruled his decision, realising that further traditional assaults on Night Elf positions would just incur meaningless losses, so there really was no point. The key to victory was Fandral, and his one weakness, his son. Valstan had actually followed Fandral down with the war and was leading some forces. So they hatched a cunning plan to lure Valstan and his forces into a trap at Southwind Village. The plan worked perfectly. Valstan's forces were surrounded and slaughtered, and Valstan himself was captured by Rajax. Rajax then took Valstan to the front lines of the Kiraj army in clear view of both Fandral and his forces and executed him brutally. Fandral was completely crushed by the loss, losing the will to fight and causing just a massive retreat all the way back through Ungoro to Tanaris. And while this was going on, some Night Elf envoys were actually trying to convince the Bronze Dragonflight to aid them in the battle. I guess the reasoning was that the Kiraj were pretty close to the Caverns of Time, so it was, I suppose, in the interest of the Bronze Flight. The Bronze Flight, though, refused. They essentially said that it didn't really matter to them because they didn't want to meddle in non-time-related affairs and they didn't perceive much of a threat. Though with all their recent victories, the Kiraj had grown arrogant. They actually attempted an assault on the Caverns of Time, which prompted the joining of the Bronze Dragons into the War of the Shifting Sands. This was great, and it did help the Night Elves quite a bit. But as it turned out, the Bronze Flight alone was not enough to overcome the Kiraj forces. They ended up calling in the help of all the other flights, and eventually, through a pretty protracted war, the Kiraj were beaten back and then sealed within Anchorage by the Dragon's power and the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. When it was all said and done, Fandral was left devastated. He had essentially lost everything that he loved apart from perhaps his son's wife, and he just smashed the scepter on the city walls and left, mad with grief. Many years later, the Third War would happen, and this is when Fandral basically next jumps into the fore. Nordrassil was heavily damaged, as we know, because of the fight with Archimonde. Essentially, Archimonde wanted to lead some Burning Legion forces up to Nordrassil, and then, of course, the remnants of the Well of Eternity, and then use that power to summon in Sagaris. Of course, that would have been very bad, and it was stopped. However, Archimonde's assault just damaged the tree, and eventually the tree would regrow, but it took a very long time. Without the power, or at least the full power of the World Tree though, the Night Elves lost their immortality. Fandral didn't like this, and he hatched a new plan to create a new World Tree. Malfurion warned against it, saying that nature would never bless something that was made out of greed, and it was made out of greed. Without Malfurion's blessing, though, the Cenarian Circle would never agree to such a plan. But luckily enough for Fandral, Malfurion soon fell into a deep coma after the events of the Third War. Fandral took up the mantle of Archdruid shortly after the creation of the new World Tree, so he convinced the others in the Circle to agree. And thus, Teldrassil was born, and Fandral then ensured that all of the power of the members of the Circle was poured into the tree, making it grow until it was massive and very, very healthy, I guess. Or at least healthy on the outside. Things were initially going well, but it soon became apparent that all was not well. The tree was corrupted, the Night Elves did not gain their immortality, and over time, creatures with demonic links, like the Satyrs and the Grell, began to settle there. Now, things related to this tree will come to the fore later on. Shortly after this, his grievances with Tyrande came to the boil. He wanted to aggressively move south and take the battle to the orcs who had been pushing them out of southern Ashenvale, and then using their sacred forest for lumber. He then began to also turn on his fellow druids, especially the non-Night Elven ones like Camul Runetotem. Basically, he got very angry and he became quite the racist. Later on, though, we move on to the time of vanilla World of Warcraft, and during this time, Fandral started experimenting with a herb called Morrowgrain. He started collecting it en masse through using various adventurers. This started to raise suspicions. Morrowgrain had the properties of some very old herbs that had been commonly associated with curses. People, though, were suspicious, but there wasn't actually much solid evidence to any wrongdoing, so he was essentially let off the hook. Later on, Logosh, aka the real Varian Rin, and his travelling companion Brol Bearmantle turned up with an artifact called the Idol of Romulus. This idol was given to Brol by the Green Dragons so that it could help him channel his druidic powers. The idol itself was corrupted in a fight during the War of the Ancients, and Fandral wanted to keep it, basically so that he could purify it and then be the owner of its power. He just essentially recommended that it went back with him to Darnassus for purification. Now, his overarching plan was to use the idol to repair Teldrassil. He then called all the druids together, including Naralax of Wailing's Cavern fame, Hamul Runetotem, Brol Bearmantle, and this is really where things start to turn for the worse for poor old Fandral. Tyrande basically stormed in, warning that something was going wrong. Elune had warned her against what Fandral was doing, and Malfurion's health had been deteriorating. They eventually discovered that Fandral was actually a pawn of Xavius, that he'd actually also crafted a branch of the Nightmare Lord onto the tree, and that's Teldrassil, and that the Morrowgrain was actually what had been keeping Malfurion in his coma. Now, you may not know who Xavius is, but his story is really just for another day. In short, though, he is the father of the Satyr, and other than N'Zoth, is the main force behind the Emerald Nightmare. When in the nightmare, he took the form of a large gnarled tree, which was known as the Nightmare Lord, and at some point after the War of the Shifting Sands, Fandral's grief and rage allowed him to be manipulated by Xavius. Fandral was not 100% mind-controlled, instead he was more manipulated through visions of his dead son. Fandral had still not come to terms with Valstan's death, and he believed that the actions he was doing would eventually lead to his son being brought back. So all this was discovered, but Fandral was still powerful and he still had influence. He silenced Narlax and Hamul, and then he imprisoned them. Eventually, though, Malfurion would return. When he returned, he used his influence to free these various druids, and then they started to deal with the main problem that was going on, and that problem was the Emerald Nightmare. It had been growing in power. So the druids eventually did defeat Xavius, they banished the Emerald Nightmare, and this was all fine. But not really for Fandral. His image of Valstan was shattered, and this caused him to go fully mad. If he wasn't off the deep end before, he was now. The druids then took him to Illidan's old prison in Hyjal, where they decided they'd just keep him somewhere safe, and then hope that maybe one day he would recover. That, however, was not very likely. This takes us into the events of the Cataclysm. Grosh's advances into Ashenvale had led to the death of Valstan's daughter, much to the anger of Liara, who was his wife, and she was just very frustrated with Malfurion's neutrality to the whole issue, probably echoing a lot of Alliance players now that I think about it. But anyway, back to the story. Hyjal was being attacked, and was being attacked by the forces of Ragnaros. This was a bit of a problem, because Fandral's prison was in Hyjal, and they didn't really want him to get access to, or they didn't want Ragnaros to get access to Fandral because something bad could happen. Well, a green dragon called Alcera, I think, decided that she would move Fandral. She told the other dragons that she was going to take him over to Moonglade because she thought it would be safer. This was false. It actually turned out that Alcera was an agent of Ragnaros. Fandral was taken to the Firelands, where he pledged allegiance to Ragnaros, eventually becoming the Major Domo, which is the highest rank among Ragnaros' minions. Fandral then travelled to Ashenvale, found Liara, and basically convinced her to join the newly formed Druids of the Flame, of which he was the leader. She was very angry at Malfurion, angry at the Alliance, so honestly, it was just a means for her to get revenge. Fandral then basically was responsible for breaking Thrall into his raw, elemental thingies in that whole weird Green Jesus storyline, and he was eventually killed in the Firelands raid. That's really the end of Fandral. A bit weird, I suppose it's definitely a tragedy, if we were going to sort of summarize it into one type of story, and he is an interesting character. It's unfortunate that some of the kind of gaps in time were not really filled out, and there are definitely parts of his character that they didn't do a fantastic job of explaining. Still though, he's an interesting guy, and it's kind of cool when Blizzard have a character in-game like Fandral was in vanilla, and then they kind of turn it on its head. I think that's really interesting. But anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.